The Tu-95 is an aircraft that shouldn't exist. By every logical measure of modern aviation, turboprop strategic bombers are obsolete, swept aside decades ago by pure jets that fly higher, faster, and without the mechanical complexity of contra-rotating propellers the size of windmills. Yet here we are, 70 years after its first flight, and the Bear is still flying combat missions, still probing NATO airspace, still launching cruise missiles over Syria and Ukraine. It's not flying because Russia lacks alternatives or because nostalgia trumps capability. It flies because this bizarre hybrid of 1950s engineering and incremental modernization still does things no other aircraft in the Russian arsenal can match. The Tu-95's continued relevance isn't a testament to Soviet genius. It's a case study in how design compromises, made for reasons that no longer exist, can accidentally create an aircraft so specifically useful that replacing it becomes harder than just keeping the damn thing flying. The story begins in the early 1950s when Soviet strategic aviation faced an existential problem. American B-52s were entering service with intercontinental range, and the Soviet Union had nothing remotely comparable. The existing fleet of piston-engine bombers couldn't reach the United States in return, which rather defeated the purpose of strategic deterrence. The requirement was straightforward: an aircraft capable of delivering nuclear weapons to North America from Soviet bases without refueling. The solution was anything but. Jet engines of the era were powerful but catastrophically thirsty. Range and jets were fundamentally at odds given the fuel consumption realities of early turbojets. The alternative was turboprop power, which offered jet-like speed potential while maintaining the fuel efficiency that made intercontinental missions theoretically possible. Tupolev's design bureau took this compromise and built an entire strategic bomber around it, creating what remains the only turboprop-powered strategic bomber to ever enter operational service. If detailed technical breakdowns of aviation design and the strategic decisions that shape them interest you, subscribe. There are plenty more aircraft worth examining closely, and the Cold War produced some genuinely strange engineering solutions. The aircraft that emerged from this requirement was visually unmistakable. 4 massive Kuznetsov NK-12 engines, each driving contra-rotating propellers with 8 blades per engine, mounted on a swept wing spanning 50 meters. The fuselage stretched nearly 50 meters, a tubular structure with a pressurized crew compartment forward and an enormous weapons bay amidships. The vertical stabilizer rose nearly 12 meters above the tarmac. Everything about the Tu-95's proportions suggested size and power, but it was the propellers that defined the aircraft's character, both visually and acoustically. Those contra-rotating props remain the most powerful turboprop engines ever built, each NK-12 producing 15,000 shaft horsepower. The tips of those blades move faster than sound, generating a distinctive sound signature that submariners claim they can hear underwater, and that makes the Bear detectable from absurd distances. Western fighter pilots who've intercepted Tu-95s describe the sound as a physical sensation, a low-frequency drone that you feel in your chest before you hear it. This wasn't a design feature anyone wanted. It was an unavoidable consequence of extracting maximum thrust from propellers while maintaining cruise speeds that approached jet territory. The NK-12 engine itself represented Soviet engineering at its most pragmatic. It's a single-spool turboprop driving reduction gearboxes that manage the counter-rotating propeller assembly. Each engine weighs about 3 tons dry, and reliability was initially abysmal. Early variants had serious issues with the reduction gearbox, which had to transfer 15,000 horsepower to the propeller shafts while managing the differential rotation. Getting those gearboxes to survive sustained operation took years of incremental refinement. But once the issues were resolved, the NK-12 proved remarkably durable and efficient. Specific fuel consumption was dramatically better than contemporary jet engines, which translated directly into range. The trade-off was speed. Turboprops hit a hard wall around 575 miles per hour due to propeller efficiency losses as blade tips go supersonic. The Tu-95 cruises at roughly 510 newtonap, far slower than jet-powered strategic bombers, but fast enough that intercepting it required jets, not piston fighters. That narrow margin of being slow for a strategic bomber but fast for a turboprop defined much of the Tu-95's operational reality. The airframe construction reflected Soviet manufacturing realities and design priorities. The fuselage is a semi-monocoque structure, aluminum alloy frames and stringers covered with stressed skin. There's no exotic materials here, no titanium sections or composite panels, just conventional aluminum construction executed at massive scale. The wing is swept at 35 degrees, which was aggressive for a turboprop platform and required careful design to avoid pitch-up tendencies and maintain controllability at the relatively low speeds where turboprops operate efficiently. Wing loading is moderate by strategic bomber standards, around 500 kilograms per square meter, which gave the Tu-95 respectable takeoff and landing performance despite its size. The landing gear is a conventional tricycle arrangement with the main gear housed in fairings that bulge from the fuselage. Those fairings are visually distinctive and add drag, but housing gear for an aircraft this size inside the wing would have created structural nightmares. Engineers opted for simplicity and accessibility over aerodynamic purity, a recurring theme in Soviet design philosophy. Flight controls are hydraulically boosted, but fundamentally conventional. No fly-by-wire, no electronic aids beyond basic autopilot systems in early variants. Pilots describe the Bear as stable and predictable, lacking the vices that plagued some Soviet designs, but also lacking the crisp handling of smaller aircraft. It's a strategic bomber, not a fighter, and the handling reflects that. Controlled inputs are measured and deliberate. The aircraft responds like the 190-ton machine it is. Approach speeds are relatively high due to wing loading, typically around 200 kilometers per hour, which made landing on shorter runways problematic and required pilots to be precise. There's not much margin for sloppiness when you're bringing down nearly 200 tons of aircraft and fuel at speeds where the runway disappears quickly if you misjudge the flare. Avionics in the original Tu-95 were primitive even by 1950s standards. Navigation relied on a combination of celestial navigation, dead reckoning, and radio aids. Flying intercontinental missions over polar routes required navigators to actually use sextants to shoot star positions, calculating course corrections manually. The bombing system was similarly archaic, essentially a visual bomb sight with radar assistance for target location. Defensive systems included tail guns, initially a pair of 23mm cannons. Later variants upgraded to twin 23mm guns in a radar-directed tail turret. The logic was simple. Enemy interceptors would attack from the rear, and the tail guns provided at least theoretical defense. In practice, missiles made tail guns increasingly irrelevant, but Soviet doctrine retained them long after Western air forces abandoned defensive armament on strategic bombers. The radar systems were bulky, unreliable, and consumed enormous amounts of electrical power, which the aircraft generated via engine-driven generators. Early reliability was poor enough that missions frequently launched with systems inoperative, crews making do with backups or manual methods. Performance specifications tell part of the story, but miss the operational nuances. Maximum speed is around 920 kilometers per hour at altitude, cruise speed approximately 820 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling reaches 13,700 meters, high enough to complicate interception, but not high enough to avoid surface-to-air missiles or high-altitude interceptors. Range is where the Tu-95 justified its existence. Unrefueled range exceeded 15,000 kilometers in later variants, allowing genuine intercontinental missions. Combat radius with a useful weapons load reached 7,000 kilometers, meaning the Bear could strike deep into North America from Soviet Arctic bases and return. That capability was the entire point of the aircraft's existence, and it delivered. Payload capacity was substantial, up to 15,000 kilograms of conventional ordnance, or a single large-yield thermonuclear weapon. The weapons bay was cavernous enough to accommodate bombs that were simply too large for any other Soviet bomber, which extended the Tu-95's relevance as Soviet nuclear weapons design evolved. But specifications measured in controlled test flights differ substantially from operational reality, and the Tu-95's operational reality was harsh. Cold weather operations were mandatory given Soviet basing, and winterizing an aircraft this complex proved challenging. Engine starting in extreme cold required ground support equipment and preheating maintenance crews working in conditions where exposed metal could cause instant frostbite. The contra-rotating propellers were maintenance intensive. Any imbalance caused severe vibration, and balancing 8 blades per engine to sufficient precision required specialized equipment and trained technicians. Noise levels inside the aircraft were punishing despite insulation efforts. Crews wore heavy headsets, and even then, prolonged exposure caused hearing damage. Vibration was constant, a byproduct of the propeller configuration and engine harmonics. Long-duration missions meant crews endured hours of noise and vibration in a pressurized but hardly comfortable environment. Fatigue became a significant operational factor on intercontinental flights lasting 12 or 15 hours. The Bear's strategic role evolved significantly from its initial nuclear strike mission. As surface-to-air missiles and interceptors improved, penetrating defended airspace became increasingly suicidal. The solution was standoff weapons, cruise missiles that allowed the Tu-95 to launch attacks from hundreds of kilometers outside enemy air defenses. The Tu-95MS variant, introduced in the 1980s, carried the Kh-55 cruise missile, a subsonic weapon with a range exceeding 2,500 kilometers. This fundamentally changed the Bear's mission profile from penetration bomber to missile carrier. 6 Kh-55s could be carried externally on wing pylons, with additional missiles on a rotary launcher in the weapons bay. Maximum loadout reached 16 cruise missiles, transforming the Tu-95 into a mobile launch platform for what were essentially small, expendable jet aircraft. This adaptation extended the Bear's operational relevance by decades. The airframe's range and payload capacity remained useful even as its ability to penetrate defended airspace evaporated. Combat employment reveals both the aircraft's capabilities and its limitations. During the Soviet war in Afghanistan, Tu-95s conducted conventional bombing missions, dropping massive tonnages of dumb bombs from altitude, a mission profile that required no particular sophistication but demonstrated the aircraft's sheer payload capacity. More recently, Russian Tu-95MS bombers have launched cruise missile strikes in Syria and Ukraine, operating from Russian airspace and releasing weapons that fly autonomously to target. These missions demonstrated that 70-year-old airframes with modern weapons integration remain tactically relevant when employed correctly. The Bear doesn't penetrate defended airspace. It stands off and launches missiles, acting as a long-range strike platform rather than a bomber in the traditional sense. Western air defenses monitor Tu-95 patrols constantly, intercepting them with fighters whenever they approach NATO airspace. These intercepts have become almost ritualized. Russian bombers probe, NATO fighters intercept and escort. Everyone photographs each other, and the Bear turns back. It's intelligence gathering, training, and posturing all at once. Missions where the Tu-95's endurance and range matter more than speed or stealth. Given its combat record and the decades of operational service, was the Tu-95 a success, or simply an aircraft that survived because replacing it proved too difficult and expensive? Let me know what you think in the comments. Comparing the Tu-95 to its American contemporary, the B-52, reveals parallel evolution driven by similar constraints. Both are strategic bombers designed in the early 1950s. Both remain in service today, and both transitioned from penetration bombers to standoff missile carriers. But the B-52 is jet-powered, faster and quieter, with 8 turbofan engines providing substantially more speed and altitude capability. The B-52's jet engines also eliminated the mechanical complexity and maintenance burden of the Tu-95's contra-rotating propellers. However, the B-52 required aerial refueling for intercontinental missions far more frequently than the Tu-95, and American investment in tanker aircraft made that viable. The Soviet Union and later Russia never developed comparable tanker fleets, making the Tu-95's unrefueled range a practical necessity rather than a luxury. Speed differences matter less in the standoff missile role, both aircraft launch weapons from safe distances, and whether the launch platform cruises at 500 or 650 miles per hour is tactically irrelevant. What matters is range, payload, and systems integration, and on those metrics, the Tu-95 remains competitive. The Bear is louder, slower, and mechanically more complex than the B-52, but it still performs the mission Russia needs it to perform. Modernization efforts have kept the Tu-95 marginally relevant through incremental upgrades rather than fundamental redesign. The Tu-95MS variant represents the current operational standard with upgraded avionics, digital navigation systems, improved radar, and integration for modern cruise missiles. The ancient vacuum tube electronics of early variants have been replaced with solid-state systems, though the aircraft is hardly a showcase of modern avionics. Communications equipment has been upgraded to meet current standards, and defensive systems include radar warning receivers and electronic countermeasures. But these are fundamentally updates bolted onto a 1950s airframe. The basic structure, engines, and flight systems remain rooted in technology older than most of the crews flying them. There's no stealth capability, no modern fly-by-wire controls, no advanced materials reducing weight or improving efficiency. The Tu-95MS is a very old aircraft with just enough modern equipment to remain operationally viable in the standoff missile role. The strategic calculus of maintaining the Tu-95 fleet versus replacing it is straightforward economics and operational necessity colliding. Russia's newer strategic bombers, the Tu-160 supersonic bomber and the proposed PAKDA stealth bomber, are expensive, available in limited numbers, and face their own technical challenges. The Tu-160 is faster and more capable, but exists in tiny quantities, fewer than 20 operational aircraft. The PAKDA remains developmental, years from operational service if it enters service at all. Meanwhile, Russia has roughly 50 Tu-95 MES bombers, operational or in reserve, aircraft that are paid for, familiar to crews, and adequate for the missions they're actually asked to fly. Maintaining them is cheaper than replacing them, especially when the replacement options are either unavailable or unaffordable at scale. So the Bear keeps flying, not because it's the best solution, but because it's the available solution that works well enough. From an engineering perspective, the Tu-95 represents a dead-end evolutionary branch. Turboprop strategic bombers went extinct because jets proved superior for nearly every mission profile. But dead ends can persist when specific circumstances make them useful despite their obsolescence. The Tu-95's combination of range, payload, and relatively low operational cost created a niche that jets filled less efficiently given Soviet and Russian resource constraints. It's not an aircraft anyone would design today, but it's an aircraft that continues doing what it was built to do 70 years later, which is a form of success even if it's not the success originally envisioned. The engineers who designed it couldn't have predicted cruise missiles would extend its service life by half a century, but they built an airframe robust enough and capacious enough to accommodate weapons that didn't exist when the first prototype flew. Pilot accounts of flying the Bear are surprisingly consistent. It's stable, predictable, and exhausting. The noise and vibration are constants that fatigue crews on long missions. Visibility from the cockpit is adequate, but not exceptional, with the nose section providing reasonable forward visibility but limited views to the sides and rear. The flight deck layout reflects 1950s ergonomics, with instruments and controls arranged functionally but without the human factors optimization of modern designs. Workload during takeoff and landing is high, requiring close coordination between pilot and co-pilot as hydraulic systems, engines, and flight controls all demand attention. Once established in cruise, the autopilot handles basic flight path maintenance, but navigators and systems operators remain busy managing mission systems. There's no romance here, no tales of aircraft bonding with pilots. It's a job executed by professionals in an aircraft that demands respect but doesn't inspire affection. The Tu-95's visual signature is impossible to mistake. Those massive propellers, the swept wings, the bulbous nose radome, and the distinctive engine nacelles create a profile recognizable from enormous distances. The proportions are ungainly. It lacks the brutal elegance of the B-52 or the streamlined menace of supersonic bombers. It looks like exactly what it is, a massive turboprop cobbled together from early jet-age technology and brute force engineering. Paint schemes are typically standard Russian military colors, white undersides and gray-green upper surfaces, though some variants carry all-white Arctic camouflage. The tail gun position is clearly visible, a reminder of defensive concepts rendered obsolete by missile technology. On the ground, the Bear sits high on its landing gear, the propellers towering above maintenance crews. Everything about it suggests weight and power applied without particular finesse. Soviet engineering solving problems through scale and persistence rather than elegance. Maintenance realities define the operational tempo more than any flight performance metric. Those NK-12 engines require periodic overhauls, and the reduction gearboxes need constant monitoring for wear and vibration. Propeller balance checks are mandatory before flight operations, and any indication of imbalance grounds the aircraft until corrected. Hydraulic systems require regular servicing, and the ancient avionics in non-upgraded variants demand constant attention from technicians who are increasingly hard to find. Parts availability is a chronic issue. Manufacturing tooling for components designed in the 1950s no longer exists in many cases, forcing cannibalization from retired airframes or custom fabrication. Flight hours accumulate slowly because maintenance consumes so much time between missions. Sortie generation rates are low by modern standards, but when you need a platform to carry cruise missiles 7,000 kilometers and return, the Tu-95 can still do it if the maintenance crews have kept it airworthy. The acoustic signature deserves particular attention because it's both tactically significant and utterly unique. The contra-rotating propellers generate sound across a wide frequency spectrum, but the low-frequency components propagate absurdly far. Western naval forces have documented detecting Tu-95s acoustically at ranges where radar detection would be marginal. Fighter pilots intercepting Bears describe the sound as overwhelming even inside their own cockpits. The distinctive thrum of those propellers is audible over engine noise and through heavy insulation. There's no stealth here, no attempt to hide. The Tu-95 announces its presence acoustically from hundreds of kilometers away, which makes it useless for any mission requiring surprise, but perfectly adequate for standoff missile launches where detection is assumed and irrelevant. The Bear's legacy is complicated because its survival reflects Russian strategic circumstances as much as the aircraft's inherent merit. It succeeded at the mission it was designed for, providing intercontinental nuclear strike capability, and adapted successfully when that mission evolved toward standoff weapons. It represents Soviet heavy industry's capability to produce complex aircraft at scale, and it demonstrates the viability of turboprop power for missions where fuel efficiency matters more than speed. But it also represents design choices that the rest of the world abandoned, technological paths that led nowhere beyond this one specific application. No other nation built turboprop strategic bombers because jets proved superior for nearly every conceivable role. The Tu-95 persists because replacing it has proven difficult and expensive, not because turboprops represent an underappreciated solution to strategic bombing. It's a successful aircraft that happened to emerge from a dead-end technology, which is an unusual legacy in aviation history. Looking forward, the Tu-95's operational life is finite, but not yet complete. Russia will likely maintain a reduced fleet for another decade or two, using them for missions where their range and payload capacity remain useful and their lack of speed or stealth is acceptable. Training new crews becomes harder as the aircraft ages and institutional knowledge erodes, but the mission profile isn't complex enough to make this prohibitive. Eventually, attrition, part shortages, and structural fatigue will ground the fleet permanently, but that day remains years away. The PAKDA stealth bomber is supposed to replace the Tu-95, but development timelines are uncertain and production numbers will likely be limited. Some bears might outlive their intended replacement's development program, which would be fitting for an aircraft that's already outlived most of the people who designed it. If you found this analysis useful, a like helps more people discover these deep dives into aviation history and design. Thanks for watching. The Tu-95 is an anachronism that refuses to die, a turboprop bomber flying combat missions in an era of stealth and hypersonics. It shouldn't work, shouldn't still be relevant, shouldn't still be probing NATO airspace 70 years after its first flight. But it does, it is, and it will continue flying until something better comes along or the airframes finally give out. That's not a testament to visionary design. It's a testament to building something robust enough to adapt when circumstances change and cheap enough to maintain when resources are limited. The Bear's story is less about engineering excellence and more about adequate solutions persisting when excellent replacements prove unaffordable. It's an aircraft defined by compromises that somehow added up to longevity, and that's a rarer achievement in aviation than getting everything right from the start.